Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of a series of composer spotlights that is just an excuse for me to talk to amazing musicians and pick their brains about things that I think are interesting. And I'm honored that the very first guest is Dr. Aaron Wyanski. Aaron is a composer, pianist, and educator whose work explores memory, perspective, and vulnerability. His music has been commissioned by the Amaranth String Quartet, Roger Zahab, percussionist Michael Jones, among many, many others. He's been an artist in residence at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts and the Vermont College of the Fine Arts. An active educator, Dr. Wyanski is assistant professor of music composition at the University of Maine Farmington. He's previously taught at the University of Hartford's Hart School and Sweetbriar College. He holds a DMA in composition from the Hart School, an MFA from the Vermont College of Fine Arts, and a BM in jazz studies from Purchase College. Aaron, thank you so much
Hi,
for
Andre.
joining me
I'm
today.
very happy to be here. I'm honored to be your first guest.
So I have to ask, 2020 has been terrible for so
hmm
many of us,
hmm
especially, people in the performing arts. So I just have to ask, how are you doing?
I'm relatively all right. I'm as all right as I think people can be. It's obviously extra devastating, like you just mentioned, for performing artists. I like many. Like everybody I know, I've had like some big performances canceled. The things we were looking forward to doing in quote normal life, that just can't happen. Um, but I'm very fortunate. I started a teaching job this year, and part of the surrealness of 2020 was like the last time I ate inside a restaurant was during my campus visit for that teaching job. So then I basically flew home, got took the job, and then the world ended. So
Wow.
it's been a very so I've been very, very happy to have landed somewhere that I like, like teaching and having that to focus on, to like be actually starting something new during this time.
Congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you. I was like, but it's been so strange just to see everything to like move in the middle of it and then just like, just have the world sort of fall out from under you.
Not
Um,
ideal.
no, yeah, but like I said, I've been, yeah, I feel just very, very fortunate for that reason because so many of my friends who uh, are performers and things like that, like it's been completely devastating.
So, Aaron, I want to know, how did you get here? How did you become a composer? Did you always think that you were going to do what you're doing now?
No, not even kind of a little bit. I took a very, very long path to being a composer. So I was a musician and I knew I wanted to study music when I was in my mid teens, let's say. And but what I really wanted to do was be a jazz musician. Like that was my entire interest. And when I was about 16, I would have violently and opposed anything remotely sounding like classical in big quotes music. Um, and with the innocence and arrogance of youth, I dismissed just great swaths of everything. And if so, anything that was like popular music or rock music, absolutely not. And so on that level, the idea that I'm a composer at all is would be shocking to like that version of myself when I was first kind of getting into this. I As to how I really got started. So like I said, I want to be a jazz musician. I was starting to play, like I have a background in jazz and improvised music. I still do. Um, but sort of in the middle of all of that, my whole world and like my ears opened up to a lot of what we would then call, I mean, we don't have a good word for what it is we talk about here all the time. So like, but let's just say composed music, but that's awful too. Um, but we know what we're talking about. And early on in undergrad, I quote had to take a music history class because I was like, well, I have to do this, but like I'm gonna begrudgingly sit here while we talk about Western classical composers. And I have no idea why this professor did this, but I'm really, really glad that he did. It was a year-long course. In the first 2 weeks, we ran through the timeline from, like chant to like through the 20th century, which at that point had just ended.
In 2 weeks?
Yeah, so it was just a quick overview, and then we went back to the beginning and then did like the year-long course, right?
Okay.
And it's on some level that's counterintuitive, but what that meant is that in the very beginning of the class on the first, I got to hear in the same day for the first time the Rite of Spring and Perot Lunaire, and I had never that was the moment that really very palpably shifted. Like I remember sitting in class really thinking, oh, I'm wrong about this. Like I'm just wrong. Like I didn't know what I was talking about. And like there's music here that I'm deeply interested in. And so that probably means there's a lot of other stuff I just haven't listened to or like gotten to. So then when we went back and we went through, I was much, much, much more open to, let's say, even Bach, like, and saying like, oh, okay, well, I'll give this stuff a chance. Even through, I did my undergrad in jazz studies. I wasn't particularly interested in writing music. I just didn't. Like I
You were
didn't really
improvising for so long.
Yeah, and it's very, if anything, I was an anomaly. I mean, I think, there's obviously jazz composition is a thing. It's
Sure.
not that wasn't there, and it's not that I wasn't encouraged to write even like just like little tunes or something, or I had writing assignments for classes, but for whatever reason, that just wasn't where my head was at, or I wasn't really attached to that sort of thing.
So the first piece that you really wrote wasn't jazz then?
No, I didn't really. So I didn't really start. I mean, this is a roundabout way of saying I didn't really start writing until I was in my late 20s.
Wow.
And or like what I would consider, like that I was like writing. And some of that was I've been living in New York for a while, and I've just been doing the various things that we musicians do to make a living at playing, at music.
Sure.
And I was really I liked all these things I was doing. It wasn't like this isn't an indictment of performing or this or that, whatever. But everything I did felt like not like me, if that makes sense. Like I would play a gig and it wouldn't be my gig, it would be something else and it would be great. But like I'd feel a little bit like I didn't have the thing that was mine. Like I was like, oh, this isn't me. Like this isn't the thing that is my music or that I want to. And it was sort of that general impulse, having done a lot of other things, that made me start thinking about really writing. And then I had a big bout of I want to say now, not carpal tunnel, tendonitis. I almost said tinnitus, which is a different thing.
Very different, yeah. But a professional injury.
But a professional injury, right. And so that was very frustrating, but during that time is when I first started making like my first little like, well, I can't practice. And so like I want to still be musical, and I started kind of like dipping my foot into like, okay, what is it like to write? So the first pieces I wrote were like concert pieces for like chamber groups and like solo piano, things like that.
So when was this in the timeline of things? So you did your jazz studies at Purchase, and then you moved to, well, you were in New York, and then you were performing. And so then you had this injury, and then you started writing these first concert pieces, and then you did your MFA?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that was part of the decision to kind of do that. That was kind of parallel with one of the other many things that I was doing, like we all do when you're first out of undergrad and trying to put together a life in music, is I started teaching. I was also adamant I didn't want to teach when I was young. That was like absolutely not.
It's funny how that works, huh?
Yeah. And so, but like everybody, you start it's a way to make money. But over time, like I started to love it. Like I love teaching, and like I really that took me a second to sort of accept that about myself, that it was like okay that I have this like separate passion for this thing. And so I was adamant I didn't want to get a master's degree, but then at a certain point, you start to see like, okay, well, what's my life? Where do I want it? What are the next steps I want to take? And it's like, okay, well, I want to be writing music, which I've never really done. And so it'd be nice to get some help. And I really want to be able to teach more and be able to teach, at a higher level than being able to teach at a college would be wonderful. And so that's what pushed me into getting a master's degree and then going on to get the doctorate and everything like that. But having that time in between, what I can't imagine it being different for me. It was really, really helpful. And then when I started my master's, I was the person, I was so excited in a way that like I was excited to be back in school in a way that like nobody can who've been in school all the way through. And then like I remember, like, and you would even remember me being at Heart. Like I was the person who was like, oh, I get to write a paper. Like, I'm so excited. Now by the end, I was not that. I had worn myself very out, but that was, that it was to come back to it that late comes with its own advantages. Like,
absolutely. So who do you consider to be your biggest musical inspirations? So I imagine that there's a lot of jazz in there, but I'm also interested in, any living composers, any deceased composers. Do you have a top 5, top 10?
I don't know if I could. I mean, I'm gonna name too many people right now, Andre. This is what you've done to yourself. Because like I have, everything hits me. It's like what it is and when it hits you and why. Sometimes is like it kind of like changes how I would answer this question. As far as like long term, like this is like why I do this, like Desert Island, like I need this music in my life every day. Duke Ellington is way at the top of that list, just for every possible reason, including his playing. I mean, and just it's so consistently phenomenal. And like when I was young, like that's what, like the first CD I bought with my own money was a Duke Ellington CD. Like I was very like that's deeply my roots into that. When I was first writing music, I was my big people were like the Second Viennese School, like and like Arnold Schoenberg. I just adored that music and like that whole world, and that sort of highly analytic approach was something that I definitely gravitated to in my as far as even like process and just thinking about music. And I still love that music, like like the Ruth Crawford String Quartet changed a lot for me when I hit that kind of coming out of like things. And then Morton Feldman is a huge, like I remember when I first heard Feldman, that was a big moment for me for just like what a piece could do and just like solutions to problems for myself. Like at the time I was frustrated that I wrote these pieces and they were all mostly quiet, but then I would try to like do something more aggressive, or I'd like actively try to write an aggressive piece and like it would be like fine, but sure. it didn't really like, and it never really felt like I meant it. And I was very struggling with this concept. And then in the middle of all that, I had heard Feldman for the first time. And I remember thinking, oh, the other solution is to just turn around. And that was huge. Like that was a big door opening for me. And I think his music is just gorgeous. A lot of my, I mean, again, I could just keep on naming people I love, but I know a lot of my biggest people who inspire me the most, especially related to like process, are people I just know. Sure. Like the idea of it being a community, and like what you can share. So like, is hugely influential. That's one of the things I love about music, is like just that it's this like centuries long epic dialogue between like everybody, and like that's the idealist in me that like strives for it. Hopefully it can be something like that. So I think about so like you and Kyle Grimm being like in a cohort together, like sure. All the time we spent together, and like getting to know your music and like getting to talk to you through all this stuff, and just like going through similar headaches, yes. massively influential. And I love both your music so much. Thinking about like I'm going to leave people out, but like all of the teachers I've had, and like think about like, I don't think I've written a measure of music and without thinking about Gilda Lyons, like in the past, like, however many years. Oh, yes. Like it just like it just so she's just there all the time, and her music
Absolutely.
is so phenomenal.
An
Robert,
imprint on your soul.
right? Robert Carl, similar. Like I mean, basically, like I, like, like Robert Carl's. You know, you studied with Robert, right? At some
Yes.
point, he he would never tell you what to write, right? Like that's he's not that kind of teacher by a long shot. But in talking about his pieces in my lesson with him, like I like very much like stole a lot of things from him very directly. That to sort of like turn it into my own, you know, practice there. So like that's a huge straight line. That and then you know thinking back a little bit like Roger Zahab out of Pittsburgh is you know just the amount of time I've spent with him and his music and like just how just like living a musical life has been a big part of all of that. So like that I feel like that's what I carry with me most of the time and I feel the most like genuinely influenced by is like just like are like people and the music and like this broader thing. But that being said, like I can but because what I'm freaking out about day to day in the music that I'm listening to, like that's just so like um I don't know, that's more ephemeral, I feel like.
What is
Like
it that
it's
you're listening to from the day to day these days?
well I listen to a lot of different stuff. Um there's I just got a I was recently exposed to this trumpet player named Marquis Hill who I adore. He's like a jazz, I would call it jazz, but it's very it's a lot more cross genre in some ways. It's very like soul and like R&B influenced. And like yeah, so like that's been a recent thing. Um, Another pretty recent one um, is there's a songwriter. Again, it's really hard to classify. Named Ashley Paul.
Mm.
Um, I think she's English. I could be wrong with that. She's an album that was released this year called Ray, which is recorded entirely during the pandemic, and it's crazily cross genre, very interesting um, uh, music. And then I've been listening to, well, during the pandemic, I like been listening to a lot of comfort music, and I think
Sure.
kind of like
You
everybody.
have to.
So like I went like in December, I listened to almost exclusively Louis Armstrong. I mean, like so that was, you know, um, so I tend to be. This is like there's like this um I enjoy letting myself go down rabbit holes. Like
Mm.
the obsessiveness is like a big part of how I engage with the world and like music. So it's not that Louis Armstrong, let's say, is any less important to me in January than he was in December. But it's just that in December, like I'll go down this like thing. And so that's why maybe ephemeral isn't the right word. It's just that that's very much how I like to kind of dig in when I really kind of get going with things, whether they're new or revisiting something old.
You've sort of hinted at this a little bit already, but I'm wondering what your writing process is like, and
Mm-hmm.
whether do you have like uh, a set series of things that you do for every piece, or whether it completely changes from work to work.
Mm-hmm. This is going to be another long answer, Andre. So the short answer is everything changes all the time. But the long answer is there are some things I have learned about myself from just from writing music over the years that I can kind of count on in some ways. I'm definitely like every time I sit down to write, I feel like I have no idea how to write music. Like that's just how I feel every single time. And I think a lot of us can identify with that. And so I think it's important to say that out loud.
Sure.
um, uh, so yeah, that hasn't gone away. There, it really shifts. I've seen it. There are periods where, like I said, just like with my listening, where I can get kind of obsessive, and it's like, oh, I'm exploring this idea, and I'm real excited to, and so there'll be like a handful of pieces that like some part of the process might carry through. But in general, it's not that I'm actively trying to reinvent the wheel every time, but I really do try to approach each piece as its own thing, its own universe. Like I'm building its own kind of world. And so the
Mm.
first things, so I don't really have a process that I go through because they're all sort of like what inspires the pieces is always so different. Um, but I go through what I loosely term my research phase, which is
Hmm.
basically a lot of just like input. And that's me, that's off, that's like a combined, it's like three things that I do. One is just sitting quietly imagine like just thinking imagining sounds, and then I literally sketch. Like it's not that it's a graphic score, but it's also not music. It's like thing that does this blah, or sustained strings, or it's just as messy as it needs to be, but just like put some of these things down. um so like getting those kind of ideas in my head just out of the blue, spending a lot of time at the piano
Hmm.
improvising and just like poking around with like just getting sounds. But I'm when I'm doing that, I'm rarely like trying to write a theme or something. I'm more just like, how am I putting some sounds together that I might explore? Like it's like, again, it's, I call it research.
Sure.
And then also I'll often and this goes from piece to piece, but often listening to music very actively, thinking about the piece that I'm going to be writing, and it almost barely matters what the piece is. Like I could be listening, like it doesn't have to be a piece that's just like what I'm trying to write. It's not about copying it. It's just
Hmm.
about forcing yourself to react to something that already exists. It just helps you make choices. Because so much of composition, it just boils down to making decisions.
Right.
Um, and so somebody else's decisions are much easier to start from. you're like
Absolutely.
you're like, oh well, you're like, oh well, that's fine, but no, that's dumb, I would never do that. And then and you can be cruel
Sure.
in that way. um
It's a
so
fine
and
line to walk too. You know, if you're listening to something, it's you definitely don't want to just rip it
right,
off.
right. And so yeah, that's never really, that's not even, it's never really from there. And for me, I'm at this point, I'm generally thinking extremely broad gesturally.
Mm.
I'm not thinking about like this is a C and it should go to a D. Like I mean, that's not anywhere close maybe yet. And then from there, it's just like for me, I just have to sit. I just have to. The biggest moment is I have to write. I used to beat myself up about this. I'm much more accepting in my older age of like my own process. This is like these are the things that like I've learned about myself. Um, I don't always write from beginning to end, although I do write mostly linearly.
Mm.
And not just a lot of time. Like a lot of the pieces I write kind of have to be put together that way, is for me to think about them well, because they're about the momentum of little gestures. Um, but I have to write the first, whatever the first like event is in the piece, like the first kind of gesture, whether that's the opening few measures or just the, I don't know, an opening section or what, or before I do almost anything else. I used to try to counter this by like forcing myself to write the middle of a piece first.
Hmm.
And I've done it, and there are pieces that like exist in the world right now that I like perfectly fine. I don't think anybody else hears them, but when I hear them back even today, I can hear the seams a
Mm.
lot clearer to me in a way that I don't enjoy. Like I'm like, like
Yeah.
that's like I wouldn't have, because I'm trying to just solve a problem a different way.
I'm with you
Um,
completely on that. You know, I can't even imagine starting from the middle of a piece. That doesn't make any sense to me. Just I think
yeah.
starting at the beginning.
Well, yeah, and then again, I've only tried it in cases where like I kind of knew when I started something I was hoping to make happen.
Mm.
So then you just write, you can kind of try to reverse engineer it. Um, but anyway, I have to kind of have that big jump from nothing into something. To me is like that's like it. Like it needs that for me. And then once that's there, and I can kind of accept that that's there, because I go through a whole other process of like whatever I write, I shoot down. I'm like, well, that's just a half step, or like, well, that's just an octatonic collection, or that's, I use the word just a lot in my self criticism. But once I'm like, no, this is the opening. Like that's, even if it's just like one note doing something. A lot of it just comes from. I mean, it sounds simple, but I try to boil my process more and more and more down to just really, really listening to the music and reacting to it. To just really coming from how does the piece want to speak to itself? Um, as a question I often kind of like ask myself in the middle of writing.
Wow.
Um, but once I'm over that, like I'm not trying to say that the rest of it's easy, but like that's to me like I know when I get to that point that at least that like it exists. And then once it exists, like to me that's it becomes much easier to write. So I
Right.
spend often a lot of time. I tend to write relatively fast once I'm writing, but I tend to spend a lot of time not writing
Right.
beforehand, like kind of building up to that. Um,
You building your momentum.
yeah, yeah.
Wow. So you do you have like a is there a average composition time for every piece that you have, or do you not keep track?
Or like the amount of time it takes me to write the piece.
Yeah.
No, I don't keep track of that. And some have been, I mean, again, so much of it, as you know, to like deadlines are a big part of it.
Hmm.
You know, how long the piece, like you'll write the piece as fast as you need to. I don't know. Like I've had very, very fast turnarounds with pieces that like because one they needed to be and like maybe my concept was a little bit more process based, so like it becomes easier to write once you have the idea because you're then like just letting the idea play out. um but then I've spent months and
Right.
months, you know, like on like the same like short kind of thing, so it really varies. um
Do you ever work on something for months on end and then hit a point where you just like get so frustrated and then you just never finish the piece?
yeah, oh yeah, I've definitely done that.
Yeah.
I've done that on a couple of pieces. I've also done, it's very um it's I think I mean this is hard to do. I've also thrown out what I've had and started over
Hmm.
a few times, which is a hard decision. It's tricky because you don't want that like we all then go through the phase in our pieces where we're like, oh, this is terrible.
Right.
You know, and that and you know, so you see that coming and you know that that's going to happen and you have to sort of, you know, um deal with that part of the process too. But it can be, you don't want that to be the voice, like the inner voice that's telling you to like stop this and start it over. But occasionally you need to stop and start it over because like you learned whatever you've learned by writing to X point is is invaluable. But one of the biggest things you've learned is that this isn't what needs to be happening from here to
Hmm.
here.
Right.
So I can think of a couple pieces that like I was like based halfway, if not more, through and just stopped and then started again. And like it does not feel good, but I'm unbelievably. I stand by that decision,
Right.
like a million percent there. So that's what I mean. It's very, that's why I feel like it all changes all the time. Um, and but I like that. To me, that keeps it interesting too. Like I think that that's uh, like some of that's a little on purpose. You know, like I don't want to only be approaching it
Keeps it all
the same way.
fresh.
Yeah.
What is the most important piece of advice that you can offer an emerging composer or really an emerging professional musician?
Hmm. Um, Again, I do teach, so like I think about this kind of thing a lot, and so like if I had to boil it down to um one thing, it's ask questions.
Hmm.
It's very, and I mean that in in many broad ways. I wasn't always the most talkative in class, you know, like it doesn't have to be literal. And like, I don't always love walking up to people and just like asking them a random question after a concert. Like that is like, that doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be that direct, but even if it's just in your own head, like, oh, I wonder about this. And then you find those answers. That deep curiosity and that constant asking of questions, to is drives so much of creativity, and it drives so much about especially the craft side of things, which is the part that kind of more can be taught. um, and it's something that is no one can really hand to you. Like that's the part of it that like that constant inquiry is one of the best things you can just do for yourself, and like that, and you'll pull so much out of your community around you. And I think Andre, you would back this up. Like this is a relatively small niche thing, right?
Yes.
And so there are definitely some assholes, right, who exist in this world. Like I'm not, but in general, over time, thankfully, the trend is that I meet less and less of them in this, like in this field. Um, most people I know would be thrilled to have a composer ask them a question about something like about like so like obviously not like what's a major third, but like if somebody had like a question about a piece or like something about something that was like substantive, like anybody I know would be happy to like kind of like help that. So there's much more. There's so much there, and even just when I look broadly at my own students, um like if I can very very generalize, like the ones who ask and always have questions are the ones who I see the most rapid improvement and the ones who are just like in constant growth. um so that'd be my biggest advice. My other piece of it, my other little thing I'll throw in here, although you only asked me for one, um is just that don't wait for permission to do things, just do them.
Mm,
um
yes.
that's something that I think, in my own way I'm still learning. But it's if anybody who's watching this is feels like they're waiting for permission for anything, I give you that permission right now for whatever that's worth. Like just don't wait. Nobody really ends up having permission to do any of this stuff, so you just have to kind of do it. Like write the piece you want, like write whatever you want. Like do the things that make you the most excited, make the work that you wish existed in the world that doesn't. um, that's so much more important than needing to check off a box beforehand. It sounds overly simplistic, but like that's really the key. That's, I mean, so I think I go back to my piano practice a lot, just in my thinking and like teaching piano and like all of that. And one of the biggest things that just fascinates me about music and teaching music, and why I still like to teach beginning piano students, because I'm just so I don't know, just enamored with this process, is that this is true of everything, but in music it becomes like really really clear, and you can see like adults do it, is that you learn how to do the thing that you can't do by doing the thing. Like you learn how to play the piano by playing the piano, but you can't play the piano.
Right.
Right. And like I even every day, like if I look at a piece of music that I don't know how to play, I learn how to play it by playing it. And like that's astonishing. And like but we look back to like kids too. If you think about being like, you learn how to speak through, you learn language by speaking and listening, right? And you don't, you learn how to walk by walking. It's very so it's not that there's no process involved, or we can't intellectualize this stuff, but boiled down to that, there's something that, I mean, not to like get all woo on you, but like there's something magical about that fundamentally, that I really really enjoy, and I find eternally exciting. And but it carries over to writing music. Like you learn how to write the piece by writing a piece.
Yeah.
Like you learn how to do the thing by doing that. So just that kind of humbling yourself and just getting to that point of just like, okay, well, I'm just doing that thing, is I think that's a lot of the key. But again, like I said, I work on that all the time. I think about that all the time. Like I think we all sort of we all have our own baggage related to that.
Where can we find more of your stuff? And if we were to, if a viewer here who has never heard of you wants to start listening to the music of Aaron Wyanski, where should they start?
So thank you. Uh, so a lot of my music can be found on my website, which is just www.aaronwyansky.com. And that has links to my SoundCloud, and like you can see parts of some of my scores, and like you can kind of access all my pieces there. That's probably the best place to sort of see everything at once. My Probably, if you wanted to start, one of my more recent pieces for violin and piano, This Weight That Wants to Fall, is one that it's one of the pieces that like you can probably identify with this too, Andre. It's one of the pieces that I really liked of my own right away. Usually it can take a second, or like in the process of writing it with these different things, but that piece I felt very much very close to immediately, and very like, oh, I like this. So that'd be a great place to start, but you can feel free to do whatever you want. Obviously. New projects, it's tricky. This has been, you see everybody doing different things all year in different ways.
Right.
I have some friends who've gone manic, and then some who like haven't done other things. I found it very difficult to write during this time.
Mm,
Um, and so I've sort of focused much more my on practicing and on like learning pieces and like practicing jazz, because that sort of being in my body, playing that physicality and the ritual of that is like has been much more therapeutic for me than trying to like wrestle with the blank page, especially when there's no performances.
right.
And it's such a strange thing. But I have been so I don't have a that much of a specific project that's going to happen, but the next thing I'm writing, which I think is one of the things that the pandemic has done for me, is it also is like reprioritized. You start to sort of see, okay, what do I really care about?
Hmm.
Like, what do I actually want to be doing? And I've alluded here to my jazz background a handful of times and other things. And there was a time in my life when I was very pleased by my chameleon-like quality to sort of do a thing and have nobody know I did it. I did anything else,
Hmm.
so like when I was playing jazz, nobody knew. Like my jazz people didn't know I didn't know anything about classical composition, and like my composer friends didn't know I didn't think I knew anything about jazz. And like when I was in a rock band, nobody knew I knew anything but that. When I played classical piano, nobody thought. um and there's like a youth that going back, I mean, I brought up my youthful arrogance before, and I'll bring it up again. Like that's part of that too, is it's sort of like, hey, check it out, I can like move between there. But I think a lot of it too is that it keeps you safe, because then it's like, okay, the real you somehow behind all this. And you're sort of, there is that chameleon thing. And it's all valid, all of those things. There's real sincere love in all these directions. But I was very happy keeping them compartmentalized forever, even though I'm sure that they like ideas interchange, especially. So the in being deeply introspective through the pandemic, I've realized how important it is for me to break down those walls for myself.
Mm,
And so I really the next like bigger piece I'm going to be working on is going to be an extended work or series of works for piano trio, like jazz piano trio, piano bass drums,
mm.
so that and which to then hopefully put out as an album once it can be recorded and performed in a safe way.
Right.
So that's like on the horizon, the medium distance horizon.
I look forward to that.
Me too.
That's awesome. Well, Aaron, thank you so much. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I really loved talking to you about your music and your process and your background and all of these different things that have influenced you. And I hope that this is the first of many, many episodes talking with different composers. So if you enjoyed this content, please leave a like, subscribe, and I'll leave links down in the description where you can find lots of Aaron's stuff.